Well, good morning, everyone. Again, let's start with the Hawk special operation and sequence. As you can see, the Hawk has a dark until activated point. It's the only device that's in the manual that does that. The first Hawk was installed 12 years ago and now used throughout the nation. We found that having a Hawk go from a dark until activated has a very effective element in getting a good driver response. So it's important because some of the states who put in Hawks decided to leave them flashing amber constantly, and they were getting poorer driver response. So it's best to use the sequence that's in the manual on uniform traffic control devices. The unit is dark until activated, goes to flashing yellow to alert the approaching driver that it's coming on, steady yellow to alert the driver that a stop command will be given, a dual red, then alternating red. When the pedestrians move to a safe place, allow the drivers to move, and then goes back and rests in dark. Now let's go back and look at the early background issues with the Hawk. It came because many groups were having trouble with the flashing yellow lights. Do the flashing yellow lights really help? There's an ITE article back in the 90s. And as you can see, that sometimes it was felt that the flashing yellow light was like a child crying wolf. The drivers stopped paying attention. They became part of the scenery, and they lost their effectiveness. The Hawk did not, the flashing yellow light did not give the stop command, so we started looking for something better, and the history of the Hawk is we saw something, or I saw something in England. I was there. My wife had a business trip to England. Like a good husband, I had to go to England too. Saw the Hawk in an English city, and as a matter of fact, the Hawk was created on the back of a napkin in an English pub. You can see pictures of the Hawk here on the top right. And when I brought it back to the United States in around 2000, 5 questions came forth from the profession. You can see the 5 questions there. We're going to look at each one now that the Hawk is basically 12 years old and in use in Tucson. The first one is the dark beacon. Basically, no one who's been using a beacon for any length of time is reporting drivers waiting at a dark beacon. It's a beacon. Beacons are normally dark, can be dark. It is not a problem. And we had a similar device in use in Europe for the last 60 years. Dark beacons are not a problem. Now let's look at the issue of side street drivers' confusion. That did not happen. It's not happening in the other locations. The best way to look at it is let's look at a normal intersection. Under the Uniform Vehicle Code, the drivers 1 and 2, purple and blue, are preparing and waiting for to yield and waiting for a pedestrian. That does not give the red and green cars, drivers 3 and 4, the right to pass through the intersection. There's no change in the right-of-way at a normal crosswalk. Well, okay, let's go look at the situation if you put up a flashing amber beacon. The situation is exactly the same, constant or activated, no change in the right-of-way laws, even though 1 and 2 have had to slow down, yield, or stop for that pedestrian. We have in-road flashers. Same situation, no change, and now the Hawk. It reinforces the pedestrian's rights at the crosswalk, no change in the right-of-ways for vehicles 3 and 4 or the red and green vehicles. There's been no confusion with the right-of-way. The Hawk basically just emphasizes the right-of-way rules at a crosswalk. There was a concern about the proliferation of these devices. Well, there's already a number of pedestrian devices, so to help reduce that problem, 2 warrants were established, one for speeds less than 35 miles per hour for the Hawk and one for the speeds over 35 miles per hour. That helps manage the Hawk's installations. It is a starting point. It gives you guidance. And also, the new tool of the Hawk, which gave you more than a yellow flasher, helped reduce the needs for some of the unwarranted signal pressures that many of us in the business had been receiving. Now let's talk about uniformity. There was a concern this was another non-uniform device. Well, basically the Hawk was provided and put in the manual to provide uniformity and is now available to help practitioners solve the pedestrian crossing problems. To give you some ideas, let's look at some of the crossing devices were used before the Hawk? Whoops. We had the crossing eyes, a rather clever device used in the southern states. It not only showed which side the pedestrian was coming from, it told which way for the drivers to look. We had, in the northwestern part of the state, we had flashing beacons and crosswalk signs over the road. If one set of beacons was good, maybe two was better, if you saw in this Utah installation. Next, Ohio had a sign that was constantly illuminated that marked the position and warning that the crosswalk was there. When a pedestrian activated it, the amber beacon on the left side of the sign started flashing, and the sign went to yield to pedestrians. Next, California's flashing beacons that were activated by the pedestrian. We had the in-pavement lights and the sign borders illuminated. But basically, many people felt there was a need to show a stop indication. And basically, even though half signals are not approved for use in the United States, here's an indication of a half signal operation in Portland, Oregon, and then a half signal operation in the United States. There was also another rather ingenious installation. It's been in California, LA, for the last 60 years. As you can see on the left, they are next to driveways. Basically, it rests in a upward green arrow. When the pedestrian activates it, it goes to amber and then to a flashing red. One of the issues that people have been talking about is the issue of the flashing red. California's had it for 60 years, and it's been working for them. And you can see in Tucson, we tried to work out issues with the flashing red because sometimes in the early stages, the drivers would just come up and stop and wait there. They wouldn't move on the flashing red. That was in the beginning. Now we have most drivers sliding through just like they do in California. We get the California stop behaviors. It's not right, but it's not dangerous. But now there's a more critical issue on the installation positioning of the Hawk. There's an ongoing debate that was resolved by the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices just a few months ago, June 2011. As most of you know, when you read the manual, there's a guidance statement that indicates that the Hawk should be at least 100 feet from the side streets or driveways that are controlled by stop or yield signs. That language has been recommended for removal and replaced with by the National Committee. If a pedestrian hybrid beacon is installed at or immediately adjacent to an intersection with a side road, vehicular traffic on the side road shall be controlled by a stop sign. In a few minutes, this is going to be even more critical when Kay speaks because she has done a lot of testing about the effectiveness of the Hawk, and they're very, very safe at intersections. Before we get to that, let's talk about Tucson's operational experience. Tucson passed a half-cent sales tax to improve our road system, our transit system, and our pedestrian bicycle safeties. This has helped the funding of the Hawks. It was passed in 2006. We had to give the community credit. And basically, the city has installed roughly in the range of about a little under, around 17 Hawks in 2 or more years per year. In the early years when Hawks were first developed, they were in big demand at school districts. The school district had to pay a 50-50 share in the cost of the Hawk. Now they're handled under the half-cent sales tax. The community has come together, and basically the Hawks have been created a great demand. The Tucson criteria started with the warrants, and that's your starting point. We looked at a lot at school crossings and crossing activity. This happens to be a picture one near the University of Arizona, and these facts are considered. And I want you to note that we have not only the overhead lights, but also the side street lights, which we think leads to the high compliance rate that Kay is going to talk about. Equipment is somewhat standard. There's been some future changes or new changes. The costs are coming down for Hawks because a number of manufacturers are providing wireless solar equipment, and they're on the market currently. Controllers, Basically, any new controller can accommodate the hawk timing right out of the box. Signing. There are changes in signing. We started with the two-colored signs. The National Committee recommended a red ball sign, which we use in Tucson. Other cities have chosen not to use it, but it's still evolving. The critical issue now is that the signs are being used, the R1023, the crosswalk stop in red with red ball, except in the school zones. We'll talk a little bit more about that next. The school community loves the school crossing sign, the fluorescent yellow sign, and many crossings are being equipped with that instead of the crosswalk stop in red. Also, ADA and accessible pedestrian buttons are being used with these crossing devices, and you see one of the newer buttons on the left. So we're talking a little bit about schools. Here's a picture of the school crossing. Basically, the school leaders were saying, and they told the city, everybody knows red means stop. That sign is not as important as it was maybe 12 years ago. What you need to tell them is a school zone, and that's more important than telling them to stop on red. Now let's look at the striping. We basically use three elements to call attention to the hawk crossings. One is the zebra or high visibility crossing. Two, to reduce the multiple threat potential, we put the stop bars back from the crossing in the range of about 50 feet. Some are a little bit more, some are a little bit less depending on the conditions. And three, a barrier stripe so that to reduce the potential for passing as they approach the crossing. Nighttime, remember, hawks are dark frequently, so we put the the reflective strip around the hawk backplate, and we use a reflective sign noting that's a crosswalk. A crosswalk sign, of course, is optional, but we thought it would help. Next, to help with the pedestrian services, we use the ADA and the countdown pedestrian signals are very popular. They're at nearly all of the pedestrian crossings here in the Tucson region. Education. For those who are starting with hawks, you need to have a little education. First, we started with flyers and radio announcements, and on the right you see hawk crossing, watching over the pedestrian like a hawk, and now you know how the hawk got its name, hawk, watching over the pedestrian like a hawk. The hawk has now changed a little bit more, and we are looking at a split-phase operation or a two-phase operation and a pelican operation. The pelican operation just looks like a normal hawk, but it has the intelligence set into it so that when it can see if a pedestrian is still crossing. If a pedestrian needs a little more time, those red lights will remain active a little bit longer. Now let's talk a little bit about the split phase of the two-step crossing. Here's a picture of one, an aerial photo. Normally we bend them the other direction to have the pedestrian walk facing traffic, but again, it's more important to match the travel paths and the pedestrian desires, which we did. Here's a two-step crossing. Each crossing works independently. Pedestrians push the button. On the far side, you can see the three pedestrians crossing the road. And they push the button, they got a walk light, and then they'll go to the island. We use basically 10 to 14 to 20-foot islands here. They will cross the first half, and then they go to the second half. Two critical things here. Two-step crossing means it fits very well with the progression on the street, and the pedestrians have hot buttons, and they get the pedestrian indication probably within the range of about 20-22 seconds. We get good compliance from the pedestrians, and on this particular location, note that they've been given the indication to proceed at the second phase or step, and the previous phase is already into the don't walk phase, and the traffic's allowed to pass. So it's a win-win for everybody. The traffic only has to wait when the pedestrian's there, and the pedestrians get pretty good compliance, give us pretty good compliance, and they get across the street without too much delay. And you'll notice that in nearly every one of these pictures, I think every one of these pictures, these hawk crossings were at corners. And that's very important. They're very effective at corners And we're going to see that shortly when we see the effectiveness under K. Fitzpatrick's excellent research.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for that presentation. Right now, what I want to do real quickly is check to see if Kay is on the line and if Kay can speak and everyone can hear her. So, Kay, can you hear me? Okay, what we're going to do right now so we can get Kay on the line is we're going to connect her audio. So if you all bear with us for just a minute, we'll connect with Kay. Okay, we're calling you separately, so we're going to pull you up on a different line.
Hi, Kay. We're connecting you to the webinar. 1 second.
All right, everyone. Here's Kay Fitzpatrick. We'll see if this works. Try it again, Kay.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Thank you.
All right. Can you give me control of the...
This is Ron Van Houten. I can barely hear Kay, and I don't know if the other people out there can hear her, or if they're hearing her any better than I am.
Okay, we're hearing that the audio is really quiet.
I heard you say, does that help any, but it's really faint. I don't know if we have anybody else who can comment. Richard, can you hear her clearly?
I can barely hear you, Kay.
I will try to speak louder. How about that?
It's really hard to hear you, Kay. This is Ron again.
Can you give me control of the slide? And
Yes, I can. Hold on just a second, Kay. Okay, Kay, just a second. We're going to try to call you on a different line. I'm going to hang up and call you back on a different line. Hold on just a second.
If you'd like to make a call, please.
Hi, can everyone hear Kay now? Give us some feedback if you would. You've been very good about giving us feedback in the chat pod. So, Kay, start talking and see if you can hear her.
all right. My part of the presentation today is on effectiveness of the hog, not on the challenges I'm having with the phone system. So I think my computer is completely locked up.
So here's what we're going to do is, Richard, if you can navigate through the slides for Kay, I'm going to give you audio control. If you can navigate through Kay's slides, then she can talk through them. That's
I'll be glad to.
Great.
Okay, is my sound level good?
Yes, we're getting good feedback.
Yeah.
Okay. My portion of the presentation is on the effectiveness of the beacon, of the hawk beacon, now commonly called the Pedestrian Hybrid Beacon. What I want to start with is a study that was done a number of years ago for a TCRP NCHRP project. If you want more information, the report number is on this slide, and I will provide you the web address at the end of my presentation. These slides, are we having a problem?
No, I think everything's good.
Okay, these slides will be available in PDF. Dan will send out by email. The effectiveness of 9 different treatments were studied. Oh, sorry, Richard, go back. The effectiveness of 9 different treatments were studied under the TCRP project. You can see the different treatments along the x-axis. The ones I want to draw your attention to are the ones on the left. Those are the mid-rock signal that are in Los Angeles, the Hawk Beacon, which at this time were exclusive in Arizona, and the half signal, which was in the Pacific Northwest. The reason why I'm drawing your attention to those is because those were the devices that had better than 95% motor shielding. When we say motor shielding, what we mean is we are looking at the number of vehicles that yielded to a pedestrian that had indicated a desire to cross the street compared to the total number of vehicles at that crossing. So when you have 50% yielding, then that means only half of the drivers that should have yielded did actually yield to the pedestrian. As we can see here with the 3 that are circled in red, those all had motor shielding rates of about 95% or better. And what this graph told us is that if you want to have high compliance, then you need to look at devices that show a red indication. And we took this finding to the National Committee to encourage them to include more devices that have a red indication in the manual to expand the toolbox that engineers have available to treat pedestrian crossings. So we do see the Hawk Beacon has a very high motor shielding. And on the next slide, you'll see that the next question then became, well, are they safe? Is the Hawk crossing safer than other types of treatments, or if the Hawk was not present? The anecdotal evidence in Tucson is yes, that they were safer. However, what was not available was a comprehensive safety evaluation of the device. So the Federal Highway Administration did sponsor a study that began in the fall of 2007, which TTI also was able to do. And at the start of the study, the City of Tucson sent us a list of all of their intersections with a Hawk Beacon. And from that list, we were able to select 21 sites that had been installed long enough so that we would have after data, and that didn't have other issues with the site, such as other treatments being installed at the same time as the Hawk, which can confound your results. So we had 21 treated sites, and we had, as part of the Empirical Bayes methodology, you have to have what's known as reference sites. These are sites that are very, very similar to your treated site, with the exception that it does not have the treatment. And you use these reference sites to help predict the number of crashes that would have occurred if the treatment had not been installed. And so the reference sites become very critical and within the Empirical Bayes method. So on the next slide, what I will show you is the characteristics of those 21 Hawk sites. The majority of the 21 sites had 4 lanes for the crossing. About a third of them had 6 lanes. So already you can see that these Hawk Beacons are being used at wider crossings. The graph on the right shows you the posted speed limit at these sites. One of the 21 sites had 30 miles per hour. The majority, 52% of the sites, had a posted speed limit of 40 miles per hour, with the balance having 35 miles per hour. Slightly more than half of these 21 sites did have a median. The graph on the bottom right shows you a cumulative distribution plot of the average daily traffic that was present on the major roadway at these sites. And it also shows you the curve for the reference sites, so that you can kind of see that what we did try to do is match volume on these crossings. Then about half of the sites had 40,000 ADT or more. On the next slide is a graphic that I'm using that trying to explain the data set, the crash data set that we use. We actually use two crash data sets. The first one, we nicknamed intersecting street name crashes. And the reason why is because the way Tucson manages their crashes is that they assign the major street name and the minor street name. And so when you go in and you're trying to find the number of crashes at an intersection, you use the street names to identify those crashes. And so that was our first crash data set that we looked at, was using these intersecting street name variables to identify the crashes that happen at the 21 treated sites and the more than 100 reference sites. And on the next slide, you can see the results from the Empirical Bayes evaluation. Now remember, the Empirical Bayes predicts the number of crashes that would have occurred at a treated site if the treatment would not have been installed. So if you look under the total column, there were actually 508 crashes in the after period. Empirical Bayes, and I can go into a lot of detail about how that 624.5 number came about, but we don't have enough time today. That's what the procedure predicted, and the difference between the 624.5 that's predicted and the actual number of crashes observed gives us a reduction of 19%, and that was statistically significant. If you look under the severe column, in the safety community, the preference is to use severe crashes because of some concerns with the way property damage-related crashes are reported. So we did check the severe. We saw that there was a reduction in the number of crashes. However, because of small sample size, we did not find it statistically significant. For pedestrians, we also found statistically significant reduction, this time of 69% in pedestrian-related crashes. On the next slide is the graphic that tries to relate the second data set that we looked at. The first one was intersecting street name crashes, so it's any crash that had the same major or minor street names as the intersections of interest. Now, some would say, well, you may have a crash that's really associated with the driveway on the major street, not associated with the intersection per se. And therefore, you should only use those crashes that are related to the intersection. There is a variable in the Tucson database called intersection-related crashes, with possible answers being yes, no, or blank. So in theory, the intersection-related crashes should be more related to what's happening at the intersection. However, over a third of the crashes within the Tucson database did not have any answer, yes or no, for that field. And when we did some spot checks with some hard copy police reports, we think that it may not be as robust of a variable as it could be, and so that's why we use both data sets in our analysis, and you can look at the two and make some judgment. I also wanted to point out that if one of the characteristics about the Houten beacon is that it's an attractor, because it now stops the vehicles. It will be more attractive to pedestrians to walk the extra distance to the intersection. So in the before case, you may have a pedestrian that's crossing mid-block, and the intersecting street name crash data set would have picked up that crash. Whereas in the after condition, that pedestrian is now walking all the way to the actual crossing. So that's another reason why we felt that we needed to bring both data sets forward. On the next slide, you'll see the results the intersection-related crashes, and it's pretty similar in that both total and pedestrian crash reduction was statistically significant. Again, the severe one having even more of a problem with the limited sample size. So with total crashes at the intersection itself, we saw a 29% reduction, and for pedestrians, a 65% reduction. So the next slide is a summary of the findings. The majority of this presentation was on the safety evaluation of the Houten beacon, where we did use the industry standard Empirical Bayes method. We had 21 treatment sites, and all 21 of those sites were at controlled intersections or major driveways. We had over 100 reference generalized intersections, and because of the characteristics of the crashes, our recommendation for inclusion in the Highway Safety Manual is a 29% reduction in total crashes and a 69% reduction in pedestrian crashes. The next slide shows the web addresses for the different reports if you would like more information. And with that, I suggest we now turn it over to Ron to talk about the rectangular rapid flashing beacon.
All right, thank you so much, Kay, for providing that presentation, and I'm glad we got the audio issues at least partially resolved there. I'm going to turn it over to Ron to continue the presentation and talk about the rapid flashing beacon. So Ron, I'm going to hand you computer control.
Excuse me, go to meeting V4.8 needs your attention.
Okay, do you have my
set up there, Ron?
Yeah, I'm here. Do you have my screen?
Great. I do.
Good. Okay, I think we're all right then, and I should get rid of, you probably can see the GoToMeeting, the web thing here. I can't seem to close that.
Excuse me.
Sorry about that. I'm leaving the webinar by mistake.
Okay, it seems like Ron just probably disconnected from the session, so I'm going to see if we can get him back on. In the meantime, I think we can probably, Richard, are you still there on the line?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, Richard, while we're waiting for Ron to get back, we have some questions that have been presented to us that you might be able to help us answer. So I want to see if I can pose some of those to you.
Certainly.
So someone has asked, they said they've been looking at the pedestrian hybrid beacon, and they're thinking that it's appropriate to add an interval to the standard operation.
And you can hear me again? I'm back. I am back.
Hey, Ron. Ron, you're there. Okay.
I did something. That thing was, the web thing was in the way on my screen, so I hit it and closed it by mistake. I meant to minimize it. We're okay now? Can you see my screen?
I'm going to give it to you right now.
Excuse me. Go to meeting V4.8 needs your attention.
Okay, I do that, and then your screen's showing too. But if you're only seeing my screen, it's fine. Can you only see my screen now?
I can see your screen.
And you're just getting my slides?
So go ahead and start your presentation, and we'll be good.
Okay, done. I'm going.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Take it over. We'll continue with the questions after this part of the presentation.
Okay, great. Sorry about that little glitch there. The RRFB, to start off, is two yellow emergency flashes mounted on the crosswalk sign at the crosswalk. And there are two of the signs mounted, and at the bottom of the sign, and they don't do a wigwag fashion, but a wigwag flash rate, but they give something which I would call an irregular flash pattern. That closest, the best way to describe it would be, without giving you the exact pattern, which would take some time, is it's a stutter flash. In other words, it's a very irregular flash. It breaks down your prediction. It's not a left-right, straightforward flash pattern. And it's very, very intense. Even on a very sunny day, it's just like you'd see a police car, any emergency vehicle, you can see this flash. And I think those are critical variables in terms of its efficacy. Now, I bring up Charlie Segur's work momentarily as a bit of an introduction, because multiple threat crashes are a serious problem. And the tools we're talking about are tools for multi-lane roads by and large. They really shouldn't be necessary for a road with one lane in each direction. And so what Charlie found is that over 12,000, you start to see marking crosswalks alone to lead to be associated with increased crashes. And at 15, but if you have a median, you can postpone that to 15,000 ADT. I'll tell you what I've thought, and I think Charlie agrees with this, and that is that when you have ADT is a surrogate for a multiple thread crash. In other words, the higher the volume, the more likely there'll be a car in the next lane when a car in one lane yields for you. In the next travel lane, you have a greater probability there'll be a car going in the same direction, which may not yield to you. And so you have the risk of a multiple thread crash. And so that's why we need these tools, and that's why these tools have been developed. The RRFB, here's a picture of one. They're not photogenic in a sense, but because you can't see the pattern, you really can't see in the picture the intensity of the device. But it is a very intense flasher, and again, I think that's really the critical variable. We compared the RRFB in the initial work to an overhead beacon, and you can see here in St. Petersburg, Florida, we got about 11% yielding to the baseline condition. And the yellow flashing beacon, as Richard Nassi pointed out, doesn't add much, if anything, to nothing at all. However, the RRFB, in one case we have two of them, is up in the 80s, and when we had one in the median island as well, so you were looking at kind of a gateway, a flasher on each side of the roadway, we pushed close to 90% at this particular site. RRFB compared to a traditional side-mounted beacon in the next slide, and you can see that, again, in this site we have a baseline of 0, which is not that unusual in some Florida cities, about 15% with the side-mounted beacon, mounted in the same way as the RRFB would be mounted, but a traditional flasher. And then the RRFB, again, generating much higher yield, commanding much better performance in terms of yielding. So these are clearly the regular flashing beacon, even when it's pedestrian activated, is not nearly as effective at getting the driver's attention or commanding compliance from the driver. Results from 22 sites in 3 regions of the U.S. Baseline yielding averaged about 4%, ranging from 0 to 26% at these sites. And after 1 week, yielding averaged 79%, ranging from 64 to 97%. Now, all 22 of these weren't installed the same day. They were installed over a period of time, and they were monitored over a period of time. After 1 month, yielding averaged 84%, ranging from 62 to 96%. And after 2 years, they averaged 84%, ranging from 72 to 96%. Most of these were in St. Petersburg, Florida, and I'll come back to that later, why that might be important. A couple of them were in Illinois, and one was in Washington, D.C. And subsequently, some other people have replicated in other jurisdictions, getting some pretty good data. Okay, and there we go. Here's the characteristics of these roads. You can see most of them are 4-lane roads. There's a couple of 3s, and there's even a few 2-lane roads here where these beacons were installed. The speed limits varied from 35 to 40 miles an hour, and ADTs varied over a wide range. The highest ADT we have here is 18,367, another one at 17,657. I don't know how these compare, again, to other different studies that have been done. And here's the data. You probably can see it on your computer screen. You'll notice that results vary across sites. Some sites get better performance than others, and I'm going to come back to that as well. There's even a wider range than you see in this study, because I've done some subsequent work on this, and I think it's important to understand there are variables that influence how well things work. Here's some data from Miami-Dade. A lot of the time when I run research on these devices, what I'll do is go in each day and collect data points. Sometimes we collect more than 1 data point in a day. And this is to give you an example of the bounce that you might see at a site. This is one in Miami-Dade. And there's baseline 0% yielding. You clearly see with the RRFB we get much better yielding, back to baseline, back to flasher, baseline. And you can see there's these differences. These ends are rather small because these are local residents in these, not our stage crossing procedure we often follow. Although the data look very similar at these 2 sites. you look at conflicts, you can see this, and these are conflicts that involve evasive action. We don't have enough of these installed really at that time to be able to do a crash analysis, which is the gold standard. But looking at conflicts, you can see real significant reductions in conflicts. You see the first data line for data path is for baseline. There's quite a few conflicts. There are none at all when the flash is in play. Then we go to baseline, flasher, and you can see that there was never a conflict actually during the flasher condition. There was one day. You can see right near the end. But basically, it really does, during day and night operations, it was very effective and it reduced the conflicts by quite a bit. Also, the percentage of people trapped, if there was just a double yellow line, we found that people trapped greatly goes down with these flashes because compliance is so high. And that's to be expected. You would expect that anything that was this effective would reduce the percentage of people trapped in the center on a yellow line. But I think that's a significant variable because if you don't have a median, that gets back to Charlie's gear study. Once you get across, you see a gap the first half of a road. It's got a fairly high ADT, maybe some fast-moving traffic. Oh, I got a gap, and I get in the middle. Now you're standing on that line, and you can't get past the second half because there's traffic there. And all of a sudden, cars start passing right behind your heels. That's not a, it tends to raise the anxiety level somewhat. And I think people then may select an inadequate gap to get out of the roadway at that point because there's always the danger that a person is really going to feel so uncomfortable that they'll be highly motivated to get out of the roadway. So good compliance levels, of course, work, but so does a median island work to help people in selecting better gaps. If you have a refuge island or a median island. Again, though, we can go forward on this. Results may vary. That sounds like some kind of weight loss program I'm talking about here. But I think in traffic engineering, results do vary. And they vary because there are many contextual variables that influence human behavior. And there are lots of other variables that we don't control in our studies. For example, the amount of education. Sometimes we control it. That's obviously within our control. The amount of enforcement, potentially within our control, but it's going to be a variable. But there are also contextual variables, cultural variables. Cultural variables aren't within our control, and they can influence how well a technology is going to work in a particular circumstance. We have to be always mindful of that fact that these kinds of variables can be very powerful. First question I'm going to ask when we look at how effective the device is does the device meet the standard? Well, right now for the RRFB, it's not in the manual, but there is interim approval. And if you install one, you're expected to abide by that interim approval. And that relates to the size of the device, the separation between the devices, the flash pattern, and particularly a very important variable besides flash pattern is the luminosity. And if you look at that standard, Federal Highway's interim approval requires that you comply with SAE J595. That's the Society for Automotive Engineers standard. Why are we referring to SAE? We're referring to the Society for Automotive Engineers because they set the standards for emergency flashers. And if the flasher you put up doesn't meet that standard, and I'm aware that some of them don't, I've seen some that didn't at least, I don't know at this point whether there's anyone manufacturing that don't meet that standard, you may not expect the same results that our research produced. Okay, so that's a consideration. All you need to do there, I think, is ask for the certificate of compliance, the buyer beware, when you purchase one. And it has to meet 2 photometry standards, and those are listed on this slide. That's the J595 Class 2 and J595 Class 3. If you don't meet these, then if you don't meet these standards, so if the vendor doesn't have that certificate of compliance, then you need to be aware that you may not actually be putting up a device that's been approved, that's been given interim approval. So this is something for the buyer to be concerned about. But if you are evaluating the device, this is something to obviously look at. Other critical factors, maybe the number of lanes that need to be crossed. Will this device work as well when there are 6 lanes versus 2? Does that interact with ADT? Does it interact with lane width? Does it interact with vehicle speed? All of these are variables, and yes, they can make a difference, not just for the RRFB, they can make a difference for the Hawk or the hybrid beacon, because any of the devices we put up are going to perhaps vary based on these characteristics. The presence or absence of a history of reinforcement is important. In St. Petersburg, we had a history of enforcement from the police, and yet during baseline, yielding was very low, even with that history. And when the device was on, it was higher. But it may have been higher than it otherwise would have been because, you know, enforcement gives credibility to engineering devices. But if there's no engineering device, then all they're doing is discriminating whether there's a pedestrian standing there. And that may not be as obvious as this beacon flashing. So that may, the results we've obtained may be somewhat dependent on history of enforcement and cultural factors. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm doing a study right now with the state of Michigan, with Michigan DOT, and working with Deirdre Thompson there. And one of the things, we're looking at a number of variables. We're looking at the installations of Hawks, and we're looking at installation of RRFBs in Michigan. And we're finding that results do vary. And in some areas of Michigan, they seem to work less well than in other areas. And I think there may be cultural variables. Education and enforcement can help to shift the culture, but those are variables that may have to be respected. And, you know, if you don't get the same results that others have gotten, you might have to look and see what other variables may be at work. The presence of effective outreach efforts, of course, is another factor that comes into play here. One of the early things we did is with a, you know, here's a study, well, actually with a two-lane approach, and this is Maple and Farmington. This is at a roundabout where the RRFB was applied, and you can see that there's baseline, the yielding is quite low, averaging around 30%. It goes up fairly high with the RRFB in the first time we implemented it. Back to baseline and implemented it again, and we probably should go back there and collect some more data. But it's very clear that it works reasonably well there, at least comparable to how it's worked at other places. On a three-lane approach, which these are very wide lanes, I should point out, fairly wide lanes. On the three-lane approach, we can see that the RRFB did not work nearly as well. We're looking at about, I would say, 50-something% compliance with the RRFB with the three-lane approach. So here, at least, the number of lanes seems to be associated. This is preliminary data. We've got it from other sites as well, but we're finding that to be the case. Also, by the way, we've looked at the hybrid beacon and found similar. Although it generates generally higher levels, there is a difference there, too, in the sense that on the three-lane approaches, it's not working as well as it is on the two-lane approach. So there does appear to be a variable there that needs attention. Other factors influencing safety are advanced yield and advanced stop bars. Richard talked about putting those in. We've collected some data for MDOT. We've looked at some Hawk installations without them and then adding it later, and have found that that seems to be an important variable of getting very high compliance in terms of yielding further back from the crosswalk, which is an important safety feature in reducing multiple crash threats. Also with the RRFB, the advanced yield marking seems to be very, very important. And I would never put one of these up on a multi-lane road without advanced stop or yield markings. And that depends, of course, on the state law when it comes to an RRFB. If you have a stop law, then you can put stop lines in. And if you have a yield law, then you need to put the yield markings in. And that's going to be critical if you want to get safety. Because if you don't have 100% compliance, you want to make sure that anybody yielding is yielding far enough back that they're not screening the view of the pedestrian or the view of the approaching car in the next lane that the pedestrian has. You want to make sure they have a clear look at each other and you've opened that crosswalk up a bit. And that gives a real good safety margin. I actually demonstrated at workshops when I trained police how to enforce at multi-lane roads that it's critical that they stop, if a car does stop close to the crosswalk on a multi-lane road, that they stop at the lane line and look. It's not enough to look, and I point out to them that if you're walking at 4 feet per second, that's your reaction time, and you just realize you're going to be hit in time to be hit and take no evasive action whatsoever. And of course, the driver won't be able to either because you're inside his or her reaction time as well. So it's really critical that you don't step out behind a parked vehicle or a stopped vehicle at a multi-lane crosswalk because it's the same problem. Raised refuge islands, definitely. I talked about those a moment ago. I think these really enhance any kind of crossing device and a very positive feature. And I'm going to talk a little bit about in-street signs as well. And the reason for that, well, first let me talk about advanced yield markings. Here you can see the issue of multiple threat. That first vehicle yielded far back, so the second vehicle coming also yielded far back. They could see the pedestrian well in advance, and that's why you put those in. It's the same thing as an advanced stop bar. You want to make sure you have a clear view, that you don't set up a screen that puts a person at risk. Here's another example of that being used in Massachusetts. I've got pictures from all over the country. Fortunately, because it's in the MUTCD, it's being used now. And initially, it was only allowed for mid-block crossings, but now if you have a minor road, a crosswalk with a minor road controlled by a stop sign, just like with the hybrid beacon or the Hawk, you can use these, and you can use them in an RRFB there as well. RFBs can be put up in these locations. In fact, most of our research are on these roads really where there's a minor street, an intersection with a minor road that controlled by a stop sign. Here's a stop bar example. Raised refuge islands, we talked about those. Breaking the crossing in half is always a good thing. And here's a 4-beacon versus 2-beacon issue. As I said, we compared 2 beacons with 4 beacons. When you have the in median island, you can also put an RRFB on the median island as well as on the curbside. And when you do this, you tend to get better yielding, somewhat better yielding than if you only use 2. And at night, the effect is really marked. Here's a St. Petersburg site at night, just an individual site. Sometimes it's good to look at an individual site over 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 days. You can see that yielding never goes above 10% during baseline conditions at night. But with the RRFB, you can see we get fairly good yielding, but it goes just about to 100% at night. Putting the not the 2-beacon system, but the 3-beacon system, where you have them on the median island as well. Go back to 2-beacon system, and performance drops off. We just covered the beacon and deactivated the middle beacon. We had a switch, and on the other, finally, when we go back to the 3-beacon system again with the median island, we can see good results. So Zach shows another way of maybe enhancing RFB performance. Here's an example of an in-street sign I pointed out, because you all know you can put these on a 4-lane road on the lane line like this. And these are slower streets, typically 20. The streets I've been studying here in Michigan, a lot of these are 25 and 30 mile per hour roads. And this relates to the RFB, and I'm going to talk about it in a second. I'm not so comfortable with this at 35 and 40 mile an hour, particularly if people are going faster. We haven't looked at those at all. But here's data for an RRFB where we have baseline at 10%. We're only getting maybe an average of somewhere in the 60s with the RFB alone. In-street sign alone, interestingly enough, gave us about somewhere in the 40s on this multi-lane road. You know, if you looked at Kay's slide earlier, where she looked at in-street signs, those are mostly on 2-lane roads. When you put them on 4-lane roads, they're just not as effective as they are on 2-lane roads. You don't get that 80% yielding typically on a 4-lane or a multi-lane road with these in-street signs. However, when we add the in-street sign to the RRFB, we come very high, almost looking as good as a Hawk. Go back to baseline. Then you have the in-street sign, 2 of them only, not using the full gateway effect here. Oh, wait, this is in-street signs. Oh, this is using multiple in-street signs. I'll talk about that later. And then you have RFB alone. And then there's another one I can't see here. I don't think this one's been updated. We've used both the RFB again and the sign, and we're getting close to 100%, at least in the 90s anyway, at that particular site. Here's, interestingly enough, on a particular street in the Detroit area, the Hawk was here's baseline. It's near 0%. The sign, in-street sign alone, and then the Hawk. The Hawk was not particularly effective at this location. We added the in-street sign to the Hawk. The Hawk became very effective. Baseline again, in-street sign again, Hawk, and Hawk and in-street sign. And again, we're getting higher levels with the Hawk when we combine it with the in-street sign. There are some parts of the Detroit area where I find the Hawk is not working the way it's working in other places. Now, no one's using one on the side. I noticed in one of Richard's slides, he showed a Hawk on the side as well as overhead. We haven't tried that, but I bet that would be a very effective strategy as well. There's not a lot of outreach here either, educating people what the Hawk is doing. And Richard, we could get the RRFB in St. Petersburg. There are a lot of them. And looking, and I think without that kind of outreach and maybe without some enforcement, maybe that's one of these are going to be variables that are going to influence the efficacy of these devices. Here's CAS, which also has a Hawk, this is on Wayne State's campus. It's multi-lane also, but it's a little slower. and the Hawk's getting pretty good results here, but again, not perfect. A lot of the violations, some of them are in the frank red phase, but most of them are in the flashing red, people just going through when there's a pedestrian in the flashing red phase. So we're getting that. Hawk plus sign, though, generates very high yielding. Hawk alone and Hawk plus sign again goes up. And here's something I think I wanted to talk just briefly about. I started to think, well, what if the in-street sign, if you use a whole bunch of them, what if you use 2 on the curb, 1 in the gutter pan on each side and 1 in between the lanes? What happens there? That's the 3-sign condition. And you find you get reasonably good respect for a multi-lane if you have 3 of these signs there. It's just like a gateway treatment. So that's something that we've looked at and I'm looking at for MDOT because it's a low expense cost thing, but of course on very fast roads or roads, some other roads, these things may have life expectancy issues as well. So there are other issues to consider. And there's another one, another gateway treatment where we have data with 3 showing that that's really producing much higher yield levels. This needs to be studied further, so I haven't provided any slides on this. This is all ongoing work. Where do we go from here? I think there's a need to collect data on crash modification factors for the RRFB, as well as some of the other technology that's out there that takes into account contextual variables. That is, a hawk is not a hawk, and it's a hawk. A rose is a rose is a rose. But for a hawk or an RRFB or for any of these devices, it may depend on these contextual variables. So anyone who does these crash modification factors is going to have to look at how they're put up and where they're put up and how they work related to ADT, how they relate related to speed, to the number of lanes, and so on, and the combination of all these variables. We need to discover additional ways to enhance the effectiveness of these devices, and I think there are a number of things that we could do yet to enhance their effectiveness, and research continues. The one thing about research is it never ends. You keep asking questions, and you keep trying to find better ways of doing things. We never really get completely to where we're going. And we need to find additional solutions that fit between traffic signal and a marked crosswalk that are low cost. I think one of the issues is that all of these devices, there's a cost involved. And I think we're reluctant sometimes to put up crosswalks because we think that it'll be dangerous, but it's just as dangerous if there are generators of people are crossing the street anyway. So, I think we need to say, okay, are there any other things we can do that could be lower cost, that could be effective and work in terms of the traffic engineer's challenge, which is to keep traffic moving at the same time, keep pedestrians moving, and keep everybody safe, which is an awful lot on the traffic engineer's plate. So can we find other solutions in the future? And I don't think it's all closed yet. It's never closed. There's always ongoing research and always the hope we can develop even more effective, cost-effective solutions and match our treatments up to perfectly to the conditions that we're finding. So I think that's basically all I had to say, and I think it's good to leave it open for questions. So I think I'll finish at that point.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ron, for your presentation. And what I'm going to do now, since we do have a little bit of extra time, I'm going to open it up for questions. And actually, we had a number of questions submitted, quite a few actually. So I apologize in advance if we don't get to your questions today. And but what we're going to do is anything that doesn't get responded to, I'm going to try to send those out to our presenters, and hopefully we can post responses to those questions on our archive page once that's up. So due to some of the audio issues that we had with Kay, I'm not going to be submitting any questions directly to you since your audio was sort of scrambled a bit. We got some feedback on that, so I'm going to try to get your questions answered offline. But for now, what I'd like to do first is we had a few questions about enforcement. So I wanted to ask both of you, Richard and Ron, if you can speak a little bit about some of the enforcement strategies that you used in coordination with these enforcement or these treatments in various sites. So for both the rapid flash beacons and the Hawks, how did you use enforcement to sort of improve driver compliance and yielding rates?
Well, in St. Petersburg, they did general enforcement all over the city at crosswalks. Because we were doing the study on the RRFB, they didn't direct those specifically at the RRFB sites. Subsequently, now they are doing that, and I'm sure that's going to make a difference. But even so, if you have enforcement going on in the city and it's well publicized and it's high visibility, it's going to affect overall yielding levels. So I can talk a bit about it. Right now, we just finished a study for NHTSA on high visibility enforcement in Gainesville, Florida, and we were able to get yielding levels in crosswalks from low levels to fairly high levels, particularly in smaller crosswalks, in normal crosswalks, a couple of lanes and so on, urban crosswalks. Those work very well now. And we got increases also at multi-lanes, but again, not to as high a level as you would see at some of the other sites. So there's a need there for some engineering to go in as well as enforcement. And I think engineering, enforcement, and education are complementary and need to be done together. And of course, we do high visibility enforcement so they know what that's being enforced, that it actually is pedestrian enforcement. We had feedback signs up. We had a lot of other variables up there, and that really made it very high visibility. And of course, we used the decoys as well, and as we did many years ago, and that continues to work well in terms of getting the message out to the public.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Richard, any other comments on enforcement that you have?
Basically, in the beginning, we did the same thing that Ron was talking about. It's also very critical for those agencies that are thinking of putting their first hawk in. The engineer needs to talk with the traffic commander, let them know how it works, what is going to happen, what they expect to see. Once you get a buy-in from the police department, you usually get a brief enforcement period. Usually, if it's a school zone, they'll spend time with the motor officer there, and the motor officer knows and understands it. We basically set up the system. In the first 2 weeks, drivers were stopped, but they weren't fined or given a violation, but given a little folder that we had shown in the slides to explain what the hawk is, why it's there, and what it means. So it was a good public outreach, and everyone understood pretty quickly what had happened. Again, with the red light showing, most everyone understood right away, and we didn't have a serious difficulty, and the police were very supportive of the program, but it needs to be done together.
I agree. I just wanted to add on that we also had used, I'm glad Richard mentioned that, we used the flyers, and in addition to giving out flyers information. It's a great opportunity to get outreach. I think giving warnings at first, it makes a lot of sense, particularly if the police don't have a history of citing people for yielding, and these are new devices. I think it's fair to be seen as fair. I think it's important to go start with the warning phase and only shift the citations once you get the publicity out there, and you get a lot of earned publicity when you do this. Then you can say, okay, now it's time to go with the citations for people who should know better now, but they're still not following the rules. Following the law.
Great. Thank you guys very much for answering that question. One other question that was asked a lot about both treatments, I'll present to you both, and it deals with cost and investment by the local agencies. And can you just talk a little bit about both the cost of the treatment and some of the maintenance considerations for these treatments?
Certainly, I can talk about the hawk. As you saw on the slide, it was around $100,000 to $150,000, depends on the location, because many of the hawks are on those huge 6-lane facilities. So we put in extra hawk devices, and as Ron had indicated, every hawk in Tucson also has the side-mounted lights. They got more expensive. On the smaller streets, they were a little less expensive. They were running about half the cost of a normal traffic light. If a jurisdiction chooses not to use all the mast arms and just a less expensive span wire unit with wooden poles, it's going to be significantly less. The other element that's coming into play now is a number of manufacturers are supplying solar-powered hawk equipment and radio-controlled hawk equipment so that you no longer have to do all the trenching that you've had to do before in the past. So we expect that the price of the hawk is going to fall somewhere in the $50,000, $60,000 range in the very near future with the new technologies.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Ron, any comments on
RRFBs tend to be, most of the P vendors are putting out radio control and solar panels. So that cost issue is, that is an important or significant cost saving for an installation like this. They don't involve a mast arm or anything more than the signs on the side of the street, so they run less. I can't tell you the exact range because there's a number of vendors out there, and they probably all have different prices. But I would say one of these installations, if you had a median island as well, might be in the neighborhood of $20,000 or less. How much less, I don't know. That depends. I haven't checked on the prices various vendors are asking for these at this point in time, so I can't give you an exact cost. But they're going to be significantly less than a Hawk. But then again, it doesn't have a red indication. So, and if you have very fast traffic or many lanes, 6 lanes and so on, they certainly have not been proven reliably on those types of roads. So that may not be as good an option, the RRFB, for those particular sites.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for that. And then one more question that was raised about both treatments. We've got some questions about how these treatments, what the effectiveness of these treatments and where they should be applied on roads that have speeds of higher than 45 miles per hour. So some of them were shown to be effective on the lower speed streets. Can you all both speak a little bit about the higher speed roads and how they should be applied in those situations?
I certainly can. Basically, City of Tucson basically does not have any speed limits in the posted speed limits in 45 mile per hour range. But we know that the 85th percentile runs into that 45 mile per hour range in certain sections where the Hawks are operating. And we had good success with them. Pima County has many Hawks in operation, somewhere in the range of a dozen at this time. And nearly all Pima County streets are at the 45 mile an hour range. So we know that the 85th percentile is probably in the 50 mile an hour operational category, and they're having good success. The state of Arizona has theirs on 40 mile an hour state highways, and we do know that they're traveling a little bit faster. So basically I would be comfortable with a posted speed of 45 miles per hour. If you can put a traffic signal up on the location, then you can put a Hawk at that location.
Mm-hmm. I would say in terms of the RRFB that those speeds are, for at least I have no evidence that they're going to be effective with those speeds. And my gut reaction, as a scientist, I can't speak as a scientist on it, but those are probably too fast for an RRFB, and that a Hawk would be a better choice if you have a travel, if you have a 45 mile an hour speed limit, even a 40. I'm more comfortable with 35 mile per hour, which is mostly urban kind of multi-lane roads that I'm talking about here, and maybe some suburban. But if you're starting to run those higher speeds, I think a red indication is really probably an important consideration to have a device that includes a red indication.
Okay, thank you guys very much for that. I've got a few questions that I'll pose to each of the individual presenters here. The first one is for Richard. Richard, we had a few questions about some states that require drivers to stop at dark signals, sometimes in the case of power outages. So how does that handle with a Hawk when it's in the dark position in states with those sorts of laws? Do you have any experience with that?
Yes, Arizona has that exact law. In fact, most states do. But the National Committee defines this as a beacon, and beacons can be dark. So that's how those two stay compatible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And now, Ron, I'll present one to you here. In situations with rapid flash beacons where there's a median, are there any situations where there's a second pedestrian activation available at the median?
I know I have heard of some. I didn't evaluate any, but I have heard of some. And I know there are some in place in various locations. I just haven't evaluated those. The only concern I have, and with any of the devices, they only work for you if you push the button. Or now, if you detect it, if you have a reliable detector, that's also a good thing. And there's still work being done on the technology, other pedestrian passive detection of pedestrians. But in terms of active, you know, if a person comes to a device, whether it's controlled by a Hawk or an RRFB, and there aren't any cars, they probably won't push the button. That's okay if there aren't any cars, but more typically there are vehicles there, and you still see people crossing without pressing the button, or attempting to cross without pressing the button. So that's an issue for us in terms of the overall safety to cover everybody. If some people don't push buttons, you're not going to get the effect. Now, obviously, the more difficult it is to cross, the more likely people will press the button, and you need to make sure it's in a place where they can easily find it. And we're getting better at that, because we're also trying to address the concerns of the visually impaired pedestrian as well. And in the past, sometimes these buttons are anywhere. You know, they're hard to find. It's hard to even know they're there. And in other cases, buttons don't do much, and there's a few cities where there are buttons that don't do anything, and that again produces they don't command the same attention, that people don't know that they work and that they do something. So so that's a concern I have anyway. But I think if you press one, hopefully they'll press the second half. We did have one actually we tried to evaluate, but unfortunately it was in an area which was a very poor area, and people were taking the wiring, and you know, the device was greatly vandalized. So, which I hadn't seen before, but so we didn't get the value of that. In that particular area, there's a median, but pedestrians don't trust the median because drivers drive over the median.
Right, right. Okay, thank you very much for that. Richard, I've got a question for you. Can you speak about any evaluations that were done of the Hawk treatment at roundabout locations, so the entrance and exit lanes of roundabouts? Any application there?
I don't have any firsthand experience on the roundabouts. I know that other states have experimented with them, and they have found them to have the same effectiveness as they're finding at intersections. But I have not installed any Hawks at roundabouts in Arizona.
Okay.
I would say that the Oakland County roundabouts are a big issue because there's a major lawsuit here that was brought to bear by visually impaired pedestrian about access, and the Hawk was tested as a means of helping and getting people across the street, and it does work reasonably well. I would say, though, in this case, it probably it's hard to know whether it works as well. It doesn't work perfectly. And part of that is probably you have lack of familiarity with roundabouts, lack of familiarity with the Hawk. I suspect that if they go in with better education and more enforcement, it would probably work even better.
Great. And speaking a little bit about the local familiarity, there were a couple of questions about the data showing that compliance is going up over time. Perhaps due to local familiarity with the treatments. What evidence have you seen, or have these been applied in areas where there might be more out-of-town drivers or tourists and people who aren't used to driving around these treatments? Has there been any thought of how to apply these treatments in those situations where drivers may not be used to them?
I can speak to that. Basically, Tucson's population skyrockets during the winter months. The snowbird population comes to Tucson, and many of Kay's studies took place during that time. So people who were not living in Tucson but were driving in Tucson were part of her study, and the results are shown there. They do just fine, because let's look at a Hawks operation. It looks a lot like a railroad crossing. They know to stop. You'll find railroad crossing signals all over this country. Or school bus stops. When a school bus stops, it flashes yellow first and then goes to the alternating red, similar to a Hawk. And those eight light system school buses are now all over the nation. So there's been no problem with visitors coming to the city and not understanding. They've seen that type of operation before.
I would say that in St. Petersburg, too, there's a fairly good tourist base anywhere in Florida. A good number of your drivers are going to be tourists. And so, you know, we tested there, so I'm not sure that's a major issue. But I think cultural issue may be more important than we think in terms of driving culture, and that varies from place to place. So most people follow what other people are doing in an area. If you come from an area where a lot of people yield, but you go to an area where no one does, after a while your yielding drops off, I suspect, or very quickly. You go to a place where you come from a place where no one yields and everybody else is yielding, you probably start to yield. You start doing what other people are doing. So the culture can be self-sustaining, and it tends to incorporate new people within it, I think, over time fairly quickly.
Okay, great. Thank you. And for both of you, since these are somewhat, would you consider these to be sort of emerging technologies compared with some other pedestrian treatments that have been in place for a while, do you have a sense of how many locations, how many states are using Hawks and rapid flash beacons, and how fast are these treatments catching on and being implemented?
Well, speaking for the Hawks, I've had the pleasure of meeting my practicing engineers from all over the country, from Alaska to the southern states, and from basically Delaware to Arizona. They are being installed at multiple locations. That's how I learned about some of the eastern state, or an eastern state was using the Hawk, but they kept the amber flashing constantly, 24 hours a day, and I was called, and it was noted that they were not getting the good compliance. Drivers just didn't seem to notice when the light went to a solid yellow. And maybe Ron can speak to the human factors element there, but if it's flashing yellow all the time and then goes to solid yellow, and they didn't catch on, there just wasn't the same distinction as it goes from dark and comes on, like a railroad signal or like the rectangular rapid flash beacon. So I know that they are being used all over this country. They're being used successfully. I do know they're being used successfully in Alaska, and they're being used more and more all throughout the country.
I think I'd agree with that. We know that onsets are significant in terms of getting our attention. We also know that correlations, our learning is based on correlations. When things are correlated, we acquire things fairly quickly. And when you have no correlation between something occurring, like a flasher, and an environmental event, something around you, very quickly you habituate to it. I mean, if you saw red brake lights come on all the time, the cars didn't stop. After a while, you would stop. You'd be less attentive, although there at least they'd be correlated some of the time, and it would be very significant when you didn't pay attention. But in the case of a flashing beacon, there's no reason why you would ever maintain any attention to it if they were going 24 hours a day or all of the time. So I think it's really critical that all these devices be activated by a pedestrian, that they be associated closely, correlated closely with, in this case, the presence of the pedestrian. I also think that, and I don't know how you feel on this, Richard, but I think the idea...
I couldn't agree with you more.
I know you agree on that, but I think that they need to be hot buttons to a large extent. I think if you press an RRFB and it starts to go on, or you put a call in for a Hawk and it goes on right away or fairly soon, in both cases, I think they'll work great. If you have waits of like a minute and a half or 2 minutes, you're going to have you're going to have people crossing probably and taking risks. That's how people behave. They will take risks. I've done some work at mid-block signals, which is another way of treating these, a more expensive way. But with a mid-block signal, I find that if there's a 2-minute wait, a good percentage of people, even if it's a relatively dangerous to cross without the signal, people will try to cross the road and will violate the signal. So there's a limit to how long pedestrians typically will wait.
Yeah.
So
couldn't agree with you more. That's why we use a half cycle on the Hawk, just to make it fit in. We get a progression with the 2-stage crossings, and the pedestrian gets a walk signal probably within, on the average, about 20, 22 seconds. So
that's perfect.
Couldn't agree with you more, sir.
Our data showed that that was the magic number. Up to 30 seconds, you got very high compliance. Very high.
That's what we're experiencing also.
Yeah, great. Well, I got a message from Kay on the earlier question. She points out that Alaska, Utah, Indiana, Kansas, Michigan, North Carolina, Minnesota, Colorado, Utah, Texas, and of course Arizona are all using the Hawk. So thank you, Kay, for contributing. I apologize again for the audio issues. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for discussion. If we didn't get to your question today, we'll be addressing all the submitted questions. I was sending those around to our presenters, and hopefully we can post some of those to the webinar page on our website. And once again, we'll be posting the webinar materials from today, the slides, and some of the other materials on our website. And you'll be receiving a follow-up email with a link to that site, as well as some information about how you can print out a certificate of completion of the webinar, as well as information on how you can redeem some CM credits for the webinar. So that will all be coming in the next day or so. I'd like to remind everyone that as you exit the webinar, you're going to be seeing a very brief survey, and we'd appreciate your feedback on our presentation today. It'll ask you just a few questions, and we'd appreciate it if you could provide that feedback to us. And thank you all again for helping us bear through the audio issues we had today. Thank you to our presenters for pushing through those, and we hope you'll join us again for our next webinar. So thank you to our speakers, and thanks to you all for attending today's webinar, and I hope you all have a great day.